So, the bookends of the mansion and the names of the mansion are Morris and Jamel. And in the couples of the Morrises and the Jamels, the women were really the strong people in those couples. Mary Morris, comes here, she marries Roger, and her background is a wealthy Dutch merchant background where in the Dutch culture, women were the ones that did the business more often than not. She is an heiress. That's why Roger marries her. When things go south and they have to leave because of the revolution, she's the one that comes back over to take their possessions out of the house. He stays over in England. She makes the journey back across the Atlantic, deals with the British Army during the revolution to get their stuff. She outlives him. She's 95 when she dies. He dies at like 60. So you've got her at the beginning, and then of course you've got Eliza Jamel, which we talk about all the time. She outlives both husbands, becomes this businesswoman, wealthiest woman in New York when she passes away. So the history of the mansion, like you were saying, is really rooted in these strong female characters. And definitely I think the vibe of the house, like you said, a house is domestic anyway, so you kind of associate it with the female sphere. But we really feel like the house itself is a woman. Like we talk about her like she's a she. So the new exhibit just opened yesterday. So it's on view from June 25th to August 25th. It's called Ladies of the House, History from the Female Perspective. And it started with our museum assistant, Trish Mayo, who's been working here for 8 years. She's a photographer, and she's kind of the unofficial paparazzi of the mansion. She takes photos of all of our events. And something that we've been doing the last couple years are events with costumed interpreters, mostly, again, my staff, who's up for everything, and representing the women of the house, Eliza Jamel, Mary Morris, and then last summer when we had the Aaron Burr exhibit, all the women surrounding Aaron Burr's life. So she came in, she took some photographs of them kind of prepping for the event and during the events, and what she's done is actually made the photographs look like historical photographs by using metallic paper and different kind of Photoshop techniques to make them look like daguerreotypes or tintypes, things like that. So that started kind of the crux of the exhibit. And then when Jasmine and I were talking about it, Jasmine and Trish, went into our archives and picked out historical photographs detailing the female kind of roles inside the house throughout history. So there's 2 additional cases of photographs that have never been seen, actually never been on display. One is solely events that were related to the Daughters of the American Revolution when they were here, mostly in the 1970s, and 2 of actually Queen Elizabeth's visit to the house in 1976, which is awesome. And then the other case is artwork of the 2 main historical women, Mary Morris and Eliza Jamel. And then there's one really, really special piece. It's a daguerreotype that's in our collection that has never been on view before. And it's very light sensitive, so we have it under a little hood. But it's one of those things that you will not find anywhere else or see anywhere else. And we're trying to actually do some research right now, Emily and Jasmine are, on who is in the daguerreotype.
I feel like when you have these photographs, it's almost like you're kind of conjuring up this age all over again.
Yeah. I think that's true, especially with the case that we have now with the DAR era. It's very 1970s kind of colonial revival, the thought process of museums back then. So they're all, it's all kind of women who were obviously very dedicated to the DAR, in costume, having these balls inside the house, and you can imagine what that era would have been like. That it was just, the house was this patriotic thing to them, and they took such great care of it because, again, like we were talking about, the house being the domestic sphere, I think they really thought of it as their house, and they needed to take care of it that way.
That's interesting. I mean, you think about the DAR, they were here.
They were here, yep.
So, can you contrast like their image of the house and you and your staff's image of the house and how it would have changed? Like, how is it similar and how is it different?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So different, I think, is kind of the interpretive elements. So they really viewed the house as we need to show this house as George Washington's headquarters. That's what it was called for the whole run of the DAR being in control of the house. So every single room was related to George Washington. The Morrises and Jamels were out of the picture. So even though there was this strong female group in charge of the house, there was really no female conversation going on in the interpretation of the house. Whereas we're kind of the flip. We've got this strong group of women in the house kind of managing it, but we really talk a lot about the two women of the house. So there's that. Similarities, I think it's really the wanting the best and the care for the house. Is that I think women, because it is this domestic sphere, you kind of get house proud. It is our house. We always joke about that. Like when people come for openings and programs, I say, you know, thank you for coming to my house. Like I've taken it on personally. And so that is definitely a similarity. And then I think they were really looking at how do we make it a viable option for the 1970s. And a museum and a historic house in the 1970s was a very, it was a look that was going on for a while. So if you visited a historic house in the 1970s, you knew what you were getting. You knew where you were going to come in, look at period rooms, learn about history. As we were talking about going to 250 years, we've now kind of gone next level. So we root everything in the history, we root everything in the period rooms, but how do we then move forward and say, okay, for the next generation in the 21st century, how do we make this exciting and interesting for new people?
So interesting. I wonder why they really focused on George Washington. Is this sort of like that patriarchal overhanging mindset?
It is, and also, it was patriarchal, and also it was so much about yay America. So, the Morrises were loyalists, so they got out of the picture very quickly. I mean, there was no pro-England. And then it was, as we've talked about many a time, Eliza was a scandalous woman. So I think the DAR at the time felt very comfortable in that middle section of George Washington. That's what people were coming for. And, we're the only surviving George Washington's headquarters on the island of Manhattan. It's a big selling point still today. And that was something that they really emphasized back then. And especially in the 1970s, it was, yay America, bicentennial, we're great. We're a great country, and a house like this is showcasing what life was like back then.
Now, are you in touch with any of those DAR women? Are any of them still around?
You know what, that's a really good question. I'm not in touch with the physical women who were involved back then mostly, but we've recently, within the last year or so since I've become director, reignited the relationship with the New York DAR chapter, which has been so lovely. They've invited me down to a couple of their meetings. I've spoke at a couple of their meetings. They actually donated some plants for the garden, and they're really excited because, as a female organization, that they're seeing this kind of re-energizing thing of the house with all these women behind it. And they're a group of women that really is into mentorship. So they kind of see me and they're like, oh, there's this younger woman who's interested in history, who wants to move the house forward. So let's help her out as best we can. So that's been really great because they have so much information about the house and how it was. So we just are trying to use them as a resource as much as possible.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Do they actually have like sort of files about the house or something like that, documents?
They do. They have a lot of documents, and it was the Mary Washington chapter of the DAR who was in charge of the house. Again, why the Washington connection? And so they've kind of been, what's the word I'm looking for? That group has kind of been included in the larger New York City chapter, and that's what we kind of have, the group that we have the best relationship with. And I joke that it's so funny because I went to Mary Washington College down in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So then when I started working here and it was the Mary Washington chapter that was in charge of the house, it's some weird connection that was meant to be, I guess.
That's fascinating. Now, where was Mary Washington? Was she here? No, she was probably down in.
She was in Virginia, yeah.
She was
So
in
in Fredericksburg, Virginia, she was George's mom, Mary Ball Washington, and she was a tough lady. Like Washington's father passes away when he's fairly young, and she raises George, and she kind of raised him with an iron fist. So again, it's kind of strong women leading the story. An interesting factoid, no one knows where she's buried. So she's buried somewhere in Fredericksburg, and her house is still a historic house museum like us, but no one knows where she's buried. It's like the mystery of Fredericksburg. You walk in as a freshman at Mary Washington College, and everyone's trying to figure out where she's buried.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. So she had this iron fist. I wonder if he got his general skills from her.
A lot of people think that the general skills and also kind of the stoic nature definitely from that household, for sure. Like, he did not smile a lot from historical record, and I think it was definitely, I don't remember, I think she was a Quaker, or it was a very plain household, not a lot of money being spent. The house is a very small, almost Dutch kind of farmhouse look down there, and that's even why when he built Mount Vernon, he could have gone grand. People are very surprised when they see Mount Vernon that it's really a farmer's house, not this grand kind of Monticello-esque house.
That's really interesting. I remember one time, I think I saw an interview with David McCullough,
Mm-hmm.
and he was saying that during the war, even while in the midst of maybe not the actual fighting of the battles, but during when Washington was in New York, he would always be writing these letters about Mount Vernon,
Mm-hmm.
and about how he wanted the house to look.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's so interesting. And he was saying he thought that was what sort of kept him sane, thinking about his house.
Yeah. He was very house proud. I mean, the house is very beautiful when you go down and visit it, but it's very utilitarian too. There's not a lot of bells and whistles to it. And it's interesting when you go, if you're in kind of that area and you go visit his house and Monticello, it's such a different feel to it. And he and Jefferson were very different types of people. But you can tell Washington comes from this very agrarian, I want my house, but it's my farm, and the bedrooms are very nice, but there's no lavishness. Whereas Thomas Jefferson, it's not overly lavish, but it's a lot of his scientific thought processes and kind of as an architect. So it's just a more decorative viewpoint.
That's so fascinating. You could just go on and on.
I know. I could just keep rambling.
But it's fascinating. It really is. I mean, it just, you could interpret a person by their home. And,
for sure.
Think about their whole interior thought process. But what else should we? That's so interesting, that whole DAR connection, and about how I think that's fascinating about how what their focus was versus what it is now.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the base crux level of how are historic houses in general going to survive in the future, and which we've talked about in the past, is you can't just have your period rooms anymore. That was great in the 1970s when you had this kind of built-in audience that was patriotic, wanted to come see the house, and just love the furniture. But in this day and age, tons of museums, technology, we're battling against everything else in New York City. How do we set ourselves apart? And it's really through thinking outside that proverbial box that we can have people come in, love the furniture, we have decorative arts groups that come in, but when we do those contemporary art exhibits, when we do programming that ranges from historic lectures all the way up through, dance performances, theater performances from local community groups, things out in the park, that you have to think about your audience being the community. And I just went up to Mystic, Connecticut and did the keynote speech on how to make your historic site kind of viable within the community. And it's really how you define community. And the DAR defined community very differently than we define community. And neither one is better or right. It's just what you need to do to kind of run your business. And that's where I get a lot of pushback sometimes from colleagues in the museum and historic house world, is I really think of it like a business. That if we can't run the business in a way that makes it viable for staying open, what's the point? Because you can have the house and we can restore the house, but if people aren't coming in and enjoying it, I don't know what the point is.